The baby was crying again. Not a loud, wet wail, but a whimper, the kind that signaled the cold had gotten past the layers of muslin, wool, and flannel she'd packed around him. Caroline didn't even stop to pull her gloves on. She tossed the hand axe aside, her fingers raw and blue, and went back into the cabin with bare hands to check on him. There was no door, no wall, only a wide, gaping hole where the north wall of the cabin should have been. A dozen logs lay near it, bark frozen, their cut ends still fresh and sticky with pine resin. Proof she hadn't just given up. But to every settler who passed by on the wagon trail to Dun Hollow, the story was already sealed. She built a cabin with one wall missing, a whole damn wall. They said it like it meant something about her as a woman, as if that wall held all the truth of her widowhood, of her failures, of her stubbornness. She reached the cradle and brushed the back of her fingers over little Eli's cheek, still warm. Barely. His nose was red as a boiled beet, and the skin below his eyes had gone dry from the wind that slipped in under the oilcloth curtain she'd nailed up in place of a log wall. He'd survived worse, so had she, but the worst hadn't come yet. She turned her head when she heard the riders. Again, she already knew who it'd be. They didn't even bother being quiet anymore. She stood up, slowly, not bothering to smile. "Thought you'd patched that up already," drawled one voice from beyond the tree line. "Winter's nearly here. You expect the wolves to respect your privacy?" A couple of the Dun Hollow men were riding by again. Not to help, never to help, just to watch. "That wall keeping you warm yet?" Another added with a short laugh. She said nothing. She didn't curse. She didn't wave them off. She just stood there beside the cradle, her back straight, and let them pass. Again, there'd been 8 snow flurries so far. The last one had held overnight, and when the wind died, the temperature had stayed low. She knew what that meant. Ground frost was here to stay, and within a week, the valley would seal shut under the first true snowpack. After that, the trails to town would become rivers of ice, cut off by drifts, barely passable unless you had a team of strong horses and good sense. She had neither, but she had something else, a reason. She looked at the tiny bundle in the cradle again, and then at the one room of the house she had managed to finish. The east wall was rock, solid granite cut into a shallow hill. The south and west sides were log, insulated with moss and packed snow. The roof, a tight shingle of bark and thick canvas, sloped inward like a funnel toward the chimney and hearth. And that north side, she turned to face it. Wind blew through it again. She tightened the oilcloth curtain and pinned it with more nails. "Soon," she whispered. It hadn't been part of the plan. When she and Thomas came west with the baby inside her belly and fire in their chest, they had meant to settle like all the rest. Cut trees, build a cabin, homestead the land. Simple enough. But Thomas had died before even half the logs were stacked. Just collapsed. Lips blue, eyes wide, hands clutched to his chest on a frost-bitten morning in early September. They buried him under rocks near the stream with no preacher and no hymn. She'd been 5 months pregnant. She still heard the whispers. "Foolish to stay. Take the baby to Dun Hollow. The cabin isn't worth the dirt it's built on." But she couldn't leave, not with winter coming, and not with what she had planned, because the wall wasn't missing by accident anymore. 3 weeks earlier, she'd stood outside her half-built cabin, a fire smoldering in the pit. When she first noticed it, she'd taken off her gloves to warm her fingers by the coals and felt it, the warmth that held longer, closer to the fire pit's edge. Almost trapped. That night, when a wind blew sharp from the north, the open wall allowed the warmth to flow backward into the rock behind her cabin. The next morning, she felt the granite wall. It was warm, warmer than it should have been. She studied the way the fire moved, the way the smoke curled, the way the logs cooled unevenly depending on the wind direction. She didn't read much, but she remembered what her father used to say about barns and southern exposure, and how heat flowed like water, toward cold, toward open space, unless it found stone. So she made a decision. She wouldn't close the wall, not yet. She would build something different. Now, on this night, 3 weeks later, she pulled on the fur-lined coat that had once belonged to Thomas, lit the hearth, and dragged the cradle closer to the center of the room. She waited for the heat to catch. Then she left Eli in his wrappings and stepped outside, carrying 3 heavy pine logs toward the fire ring. It was bitter. Her breath cracked in the air. The moon was bone white. The fire roared in the open hearth, and she moved around it like clockwork. She stacked logs behind the fire, around the outer ring, in a half-circle pattern. Every night she burned them slow, just enough to keep the central flame hot, and then laid stones behind the logs to trap the heat. Those stones, once hot, she brought inside. It had become her ritual: fire, stone, trap, carry. Every night she heated the cabin not with the fire alone, but with the wall of heat she was learning to build from outside in, and it was working. On most nights, Eli's nose stayed pink. Still, the settlers scoffed. They didn't see the plan. They just saw the open wall, the oilcloth curtain, the woman who slept beside a chimney instead of a door, until the freeze hit for real. It came overnight. Not a flurry, not a dusting, a total lockup. The river froze thick enough to walk across. The water buckets froze indoors. The deer trails vanished, and a storm rolled down from the divide without a day's warning, dropping 3 feet of snow on Dun Hollow and the surrounding hills. When the first rider from town came looking for her, it was because someone thought she'd surely frozen to death. He knocked on the stump outside her cabin and then just pulled the curtain aside without waiting for permission. He blinked. The room was warm. Not just warm, comfortable. The rocks stacked around the inside edge of the wall were radiating heat. Eli was sleeping. Caroline was mending a seam. The man stood dumb. "Come in," she said without looking up. He stepped inside. The curtain fell shut behind him, and for a moment it was quiet, just the sound of her needle in the thread and the baby's gentle breathing. "How?" he began. She finally looked up. "I told you I wasn't done yet," she said. He didn't respond. But that week, 3 more men from Dun Hollow came, 2 of them with their wives. They asked questions. They looked over her wall, her fire ring, the stones. She showed them the pattern, the reason, how the missing wall created a draft that circulated heat, and how the rocks, warmed daily and stacked inside, trapped that heat overnight. It wasn't just a cabin with one wall missing. It was a fireplace that breathed. She didn't charge anyone for the knowledge. But one night she found a sack of flour and 2 wool blankets left outside the curtain. Another day, a jar of honey. Another, a letter, hand-scrawled from one of the wives in Dun Hollow. "Thank you. The baby is warm again." She folded it and tucked it into the cradle beside Eli. Outside, the fire burned, and the wind didn't matter anymore. The wind came back meaner the second time, barreling down through the pines like a river of knives. It whistled over the ridge, dragged snow in sideways sheets, and snapped twigs into splinters. In Dun Hollow, windows shuttered and chimneys choked on. Backdraft. The blacksmith's wife lost 3 fingers to frostbite in one night, and a baby died on the edge of town because a potbelly stove cracked and spilled all its warmth into the dirt. But up the ridge, in the half-built cabin with a missing wall and a stone spine behind it, Caroline sat holding her son beneath a quilt made of her wedding dress and 3 torn shirts stitched together with the same hands that once sewed her husband's burial shroud. The baby slept in a box lined with heated stones. The room glowed amber from the inside out, and the wind, though it roared, could not find a way in deep enough to unmake what she had built. She sat with her back against the granite and her eyes toward the fire, unmoving except to press her bare foot near a cooling rock or adjust the blanket over Eli's legs. Her nose had long since gone numb. Her fingers, red and cracked, no longer stung. They had passed pain weeks ago. What she felt now was not endurance, but something closer to ceremony, a practiced rhythm of survival. Fire fed stones, stones fed space, space fed breath, and breath kept the boy alive. And that was the only measure that mattered anymore. She had not spoken to anyone in 5 days, not since the letter. The blizzard had sealed the town inside itself, and no tracks reached her cabin, only wind and bird prints, and the occasional groan of something large passing through the woods in the night. Once she'd heard howling, not wolves, but that other kind of howl, the one that sounded too upright, the one that made even bears step back. She didn't go outside those nights. She didn't need to. The stones held. There was a moment one night when the fire went out. Not all at once, not with a bang or crack, but a slow dying, a breath growing shallow. She'd fallen asleep with Eli curled into her arms and woke to an air that no longer vibrated, no longer moved. That was the sign. When air stilled completely, when even the draft from the curtain stopped fluttering. That was when heat had left the room. She moved fast, legs numb, hands clumsy. She kept kindling in a dry box beneath the cradle, packed tight against a leather skin she'd oiled herself. There was flint too, and shavings of birch bark. But the real key was the ember she kept buried in ash near the stone ring. She found it glowing, faint but alive, and nursed it like a second child. The fire came back in minutes, but she didn't sleep again that night. She lay awake with Eli on her chest, her mind turning over the risk. If she ever lost fire entirely, the whole system would collapse. The stones would cool, the draft would reverse, and the cabin would become a funnel for cold instead of warmth. The design wasn't foolproof. It was a living thing. It breathed only if she kept feeding it. It was, in that way, like grief, always hungry, always one dark hour from devouring everything. The second week of freeze brought something new, a knock. Not on the stump this time, not on the door, there was none. But a real knock, soft, against the oilcloth curtain. It was the middle of the night. Caroline didn't speak. She rose silently, baby still against her, and reached for the hatchet. It was dull, not because she hadn't tried to sharpen it, but because the grindstone had frozen to the river rock weeks earlier and cracked clean through. She stepped slowly toward the curtain. "Mom?" came the voice, barely audible. "A boy." She hesitated. "Who is it?" There was a sniffle, a shuffle, the crunch of someone shifting in hard snow. "Micah," came the reply. "Ma said you knew how to make the rocks hot, that you was alone. That maybe—" The voice broke. Caroline pulled back the curtain and blinked into the dark. A boy of maybe 11 or 12 stood there, bundled in rags, face purple at the lips. His boots were soaked, his hands inside torn mittens that didn't match. Behind him, half buried in snow, stood a girl, smaller, maybe 7, and in her arms she cradled something wrapped in a coat. "What's that?" Caroline asked. The boy answered without looking. "Our baby sister. She's near froze." Caroline didn't hesitate. She stepped aside. "Get in." They came in like ghosts, quiet, half dead. The boy, Micah, kept his hands close, always watching. He refused to sit unless his sister sat first. The girl said nothing, just crouched near the fire and unwrapped the bundle in her arms. Inside was a baby, no older than Eli, mouth open, not crying, not even moving. Caroline moved fast. She took one of the hottest stones from the fire pit, wrapped it in flannel, and placed it under the baby's legs. Then she pulled another into a basin and poured water over it, letting the steam fill the space around them. She stripped the child bare and wrapped her in the only other quilt she had, the one she had saved for when Eli would outgrow the cradle. For an hour, no one said a word. The baby stayed still. The fire cracked. Micah stared at Caroline like he didn't trust her, or the air she breathed. The girl, Annabelle, finally spoke. "She ain't cold no more," she whispered. Caroline nodded. "But you will be if you don't sleep." They slept in a line that night, side by side like settlers on a wagon bed. Children pressed into warmth, Caroline at the edge, axe in hand, eyes never fully shut. When dawn came, the fire still breathed, and the cabin still held, and the baby, the other baby, cried for the first time. Micah didn't smile, but he blinked fast and turned away. By the end of that week, there were 7 people living in the one-room cabin. 2 more women arrived the next night. Sisters from town, both widowed, both barefoot. One had wrapped her feet in newspaper and string. The other had frostbite on her cheek the shape of a coin. Caroline gave them the bench by the fire. She didn't ask what they'd left behind. She already knew. Word had spread. The cabin with the missing wall. The woman with hot rocks. The baby that lived. They didn't say her name. They never said her name. But they came anyway. Another man came with 2 boys. They were sick, coughing like men dying of coal lung. Caroline burned mint and pine needles in a pot, laid hot stones around their bedrolls, and boiled bark tea until the worst of the fever broke. One boy lived. The other, not quite. She helped bury him behind the stone ridge. She said nothing. The father left without a word. Others came. Some stayed. And somehow the fire always held. By the time the last snow of December fell, Caroline's cabin had become a myth. They stopped mocking her. They started copying her. You could walk the trail toward Dunn Hollow and see the signs. Stones stacked near hearths, fire pits dug into the ground instead of built above it, oilcloth curtains nailed in place of missing logs. Not everyone could build a whole cabin from scratch in winter, but they could leave a wall open. They could try. One family built a horseshoe of stone around their hearth and called it the breather. Another man dug a trench from his fire pit to the barn and filled it with rocks he heated each night. It didn't work, but it showed the idea had traveled. Caroline didn't speak of it. She didn't write it down, but she kept watching, and the night she saw a chimney's smoke venting sideways, not up, because someone had learned how to shape the draft, she allowed herself one small nod. Eli cooed in her arms. The fire roared behind her. And outside, the valley howled with wind, but it couldn't get in, not anymore. The thaw did not come in January. It never does. Those who believed otherwise, mostly men from the lowlands who'd spent more time in saloons than in snow, were the first to lose their roofs when the ice thickened instead of melted. Even in Dunn Hollow, where the trees were thicker and the river still tried to move beneath its frozen skin, the winds grew crueler, drier, creeks turned to cracks, and cracks turned to collapses. One family burned their chicken coop just to stay alive. Caroline kept the curtain up. She never replaced the wall, never laid those last 12 logs. She still ran the fire ring outside each morning, wind or not, and rotated stones in a rhythm so practiced she could do it half asleep, which she often was. Because the truth was, heat wasn't the only thing her cabin had started keeping. It kept people, it kept voices, it kept needs, and the cabin had become something else entirely, a kind of refuge no one spoke of out loud, not because they didn't believe in it, but because they were afraid to name what they didn't understand. There were 17 people the night the chimney cracked. It had been an accident, the sort that only happens when there are too many hands near too many stones. One of the younger boys had tried to move a rock. Before it cooled, he dropped it. It rolled into the hearth with a thud that cracked the bricks. The flue shifted, and a seam in the chimney split from the top down, vomiting smoke sideways into the room. Eli screamed. So did the others. Caroline moved fast. She wrapped a wet rag around her mouth and grabbed the boy, shoving him toward the curtain. She threw it open with one hand, fanning smoke with the other, and yelled, "Everyone out!" They obeyed. No one argued. No one asked if she was sure. In the weeks since the first snow, she had become more than a widow, more than a mother. They didn't say it aloud, but in the children's eyes, in the way the men looked at her before acting, it was clear. She was something older, something they recognized but didn't want to admit. A leader, not of sermons, not of law, of warmth, of fire, of survival. The smoke poured out, the stars above burned sharp, and the wind, for once, helped, clearing the space faster than she could have done alone. It took half the night, but she fixed it. Bricks realigned, stones restacked, a new vent dug beside the old, and all of it held with rope and will. By sunrise, the fire was breathing again. The next night, no one mentioned the smoke. They only thanked her, quiet, awkward, like children confessing sins, and they all stayed, even the ones who could have left. But not everyone stayed out of gratitude. One man, Willis Clay, came up from Black Hollow with a cart and 2 dogs. He said he'd heard about the open-wall heat trick from a mail rider and wanted to see it himself. He brought no supplies, no firewood, no food. He had a rifle and a grin that never reached his eyes. Caroline didn't trust him. He slept by the fire the first night, refused to help with stone hauling the next morning, and muttered under his breath when she assigned chores. He was the kind who'd always been followed by someone weaker, someone younger, but here no one followed him, not even the dogs. One evening, Micah found the man inside the grain sack, stealing. The boy didn't shout, didn't call, just stepped back, quiet, then walked outside where Caroline was stripping bark for tinder. "Miss Caroline," he said, his voice tight, "that man's got hands where they shouldn't be." She didn't raise her voice when she entered, didn't accuse, just stood still as the man turned toward her, his fingers still dusted in flour. "Don't suppose you'd like to explain?" she said flatly. Willis grinned. "Figured it was for everyone." "It is," she said, "everyone who gives. I give you protection," he muttered, "from worse than me." Caroline didn't blink. "Then protect us from yourself first." He straightened, shoulders puffed. "What if I don't?" he asked. She pointed toward the open wall. "That direction's colder than this one," she said. He laughed. "You gonna send me into the storm for a few handfuls of flour?" "No," she said, calm as snow. "You are." And for a long moment nothing moved. Then Micah stepped in. So did Annabelle. Then the 2 women from Dun Hollow. No one shouted. No one raised a hand. They just stood. A wall of worn faces, tired eyes, and winter skin. Willis looked at them, at the fire, at the missing logs, and the wild wind behind the curtain, and he left. Didn't say a word. But 2 nights later, one of the dogs came back alone. The next day, Caroline reinforced the stones around the hearth. She had learned something from the chimney's crack. Warmth was only half of survival. The other half was containment, not just of smoke, but of people, of feelings, of the frayed edges of grief that, if left loose, would unravel even the sturdiest home. She pulled Micah aside that morning. "You watch the fire when I'm gone," she told him. His eyes widened. "You're going?" "Just to the ridge. Need more stones. The kind that hold heat. Longer," he frowned. "Can't one of the others?" "They're tired." "I'm not." "I know," she said. "That's why I trust you." He stood straighter after that, sat near the hearth like it was a throne. When she returned, 3 hours later with frost on her lashes and blood on her gloves from a splintered fingernail, the fire was still strong, and Micah was humming to the baby. Not Eli, the other one, the girl they'd saved. Her name was Rose. She hadn't spoken yet, not once, but now she was cooing. Caroline let the sound sit in the room for a long time before setting the new stones by the hearth. Then she smiled. Not wide, not proud, just enough. By February, the valley had changed. The storms had stopped. But the cold didn't lift. It stayed dry, cruel, deceptive, the kind of weather that invited you to step outside without gloves just once, and then took the skin off your fingers as payment. In town, Dun Hollow's schoolhouse was closed. The blacksmith shop shuttered. 3 cabins had been abandoned. 2 burned for fuel. 1 collapsed entirely. The main well froze. A man fell through the ice trying to fetch water from the creek. They found him 2 days later, frozen in the exact shape he'd fallen. The settlers began whispering again, not about the cabin with 1 wall missing, but about the cabin that kept breathing. They called it the firemouth, some with awe, some with resentment, because it had become more than a structure. It was now a rumor, a threat, a challenge to the normal, and men who'd once mocked it now cursed it under their breath, because it had had made them wrong, and some men cannot abide being wrong. The preacher came in March. He arrived with a frostbitten ear and a wagon full of pine planks. "Thought maybe you'd want to finish that wall," he said. Caroline stood in the snow. Eli strapped to her chest and looked at the wood. "I thought you said this place was a den of pride." He winced. "I said it was unnatural at first. And now," he hesitated, "now I say it's providence." Caroline didn't answer. She walked past him and tapped the side of the wagon. "Unload it inside," she said. "Not for the wall. For beds." He looked at her, then he nodded, and didn't mention the wall again. That night she watched the firelight flicker across the preacher's face as he held a bowl of stew with shaking hands. He asked no sermons, gave no parables. He simply sat, humbled and warm. The next morning, Eli took his first step. He was barefoot, chasing the warmth of a sunbeam across the dirt floor. Caroline caught him just before he reached the edge of the hearth and pulled him back, laughing. For a moment she forgot the cold, forgot the pain in her fingers, forgot Thomas's grave under the stones by the creek. There was just this, a baby standing on his own, in a cabin with no wall, surrounded by people who'd once been strangers, now pressing hot stones into quilts and telling stories around a fire that had never gone out. It wasn't a cabin, not anymore. It was a lung, a heart, a beating thing. It was a kind of defiance no wind could undo, and she had built it, not from logs but from choice. She kissed Eli's forehead, then stoked the fire once more, because winter wasn't done yet, and neither was she. By the time the river broke open and the snowbanks began to slump into grey slush, the cabin with one wall missing had outlived every prediction of its collapse. The first grass of April poked through beside graves. Chickens returned to the yards of town. But up the ridge, fire still breathed, stones still rotated in their rhythm, and the widow still refused to finish what others called broken. Spring did not arrive like a celebration. It came with rot. Boots sank ankle-deep in thawed manure. Corpses of mules long buried beneath snowbanks resurfaced swollen and eyeless, and the air reeked of everything that had died. Quietly over the long months of white silence, he turned red. "I don't want trouble," he said finally. "Then don't bring it." He looked at the curtain, looked at the smoke, at the stack of stones neatly arranged beside the hearth, still warm even now. "You're not going to build the last wall?" She shook her head once. "It's already built, just not the way you recognize." He stood for a long time, then gave the faintest bow of the head and returned to his cart. No more government men came after that. The story traveled. By June, the word firemouth had reached as far as Holden's Cross, 20 miles east. A rider came with letters, not from family, but strangers. One was from a man in the flatlands who had tried building a clay house with a fire trench. He wanted to know how she trapped the heat in stone. Another from a widow who lived near the salt ridge, asking what kind of fabric she used in place of logs. Said her children coughed too hard to sleep through the night. Caroline wrote back in pencil, "Always the same way. You have to feed the stones like animals. Let them breathe. Don't wall them in. Let the heat curl like smoke, not box it like fire." It wasn't poetic. It was true. She'd learned more in one winter than a dozen men had in 10. She'd learned that cold doesn't just kill, it judges. It finds the weak point in your roof, your plan, your spirit, and presses until it cracks. She had no intention of being cracked. Not again. One day near midsummer, Micah came running. He was 13 now, shoulders rising fast, voice breaking sometimes between his words. "There's men down by the hollow," he said. "Not from town. They're building something weird." Caroline followed. Over the ridge, in a clearing cut by floodwaters, stood a framework of logs, arranged like ribs, open on one side. 3 men worked with ropes and stones, stacking fire pits, not into the ground, but around the shape of a cabin. They weren't building a house. They were building a lung. When one man saw her, he waved a hand, grinning. "You the wall widow?" he shouted. She didn't answer. "We're trying it," he laughed. "Heard the way you made the cold flip backward. Gonna build it better this time. Double wall, open draft. Made a bet with Bill Jenkins. I can get a stew boiling with no roof." Micah glanced up at her. "What do you think?" Caroline watched for a long time. "I think," she said slowly, "they haven't learned what it cost yet." "What do you mean?" "They saw the end, not the middle." Micah nodded. "We saw it." "Yes," she said, "and we don't need to prove it again." In late summer, she took down the curtain, not to put up logs, not to close the wall, but because the valley was green again, and the sun finally reached inside. She let the light pour through the gap and touch the hearthstones, still black with memory. She didn't stack new wood. She didn't replant the garden. Instead, she built benches, long, wide, and low, running along the curve of the open wall, so people could sit and feel the heat that once saved them, so they could remember that sometimes the unfinished thing is the one that breathes the longest. That fall, a child was born inside the firemouth cabin, not hers, Annabelle's, grown older, quick with a smile, sharper than any needle. The baby came fast. in the same corner where Eli had once taken his first steps. They named the child Grace. She was the first in town not baptized with water but with warm stone, and as the first snow flurries of the next winter touched the mountains, Caroline laid another fire in the ring. No wall, no door, just heat, breath, and memory, and the wind, for all its bluster, never found a way back in. The second winter came quieter, but colder. It crept in with less noise than the last. No screaming winds, no early blizzards, only a stillness that froze the ponds, solid before the ducks had time to flee. The stars came down closer that year, ice whitening the night so sharply they burned behind the eyes. Even the trees stopped creaking, trunks locked in silence like men holding their breath. But the cabin with the missing wall didn't fear it, because it had already lived through a worse silence. The silence of being mocked, of being alone, of one woman and one child inside a room half-built, defending against the dark with nothing but fire and stone, and the belief that warmth could be shaped, not sealed. And now the firemouth breathed with its own rhythm. Inside its low, wide room, 15 souls passed another winter by the hearth. Some old, some new. Some had drifted back from the lower towns, asking if the widows still kept the fire going. Some had been children last time, now grown enough to carry stones on their own backs, to stir embers without burning their hands. And some were just babies, born after the freeze, whose first memories would not be of hunger, but of orange light on stone and the low voice of the widow telling them to sit close, to stay still, to wait for the warmth to wrap around them. Caroline had changed too. She no longer moved like a woman expecting to prove herself. She moved like stone, deliberate, unshakable, the kind of strength that didn't come from pride but from having been called wrong 1,000 times, and still rising before dawn to light the fire. She still wore Thomas's coat, still tucked a stone into her apron pocket, still refused to put up that missing wall. Not out of defiance, but because it wasn't missing anymore. It had become a space for breathing, and in that space people had survived. On the coldest night of that winter, a stranger came, not a settler, not a runaway boy or a government man, or one of the women from Dun Hollow. This one arrived barefoot, stumbling through the snow as if he'd walked through frozen rivers and over splintered stone to reach them. Caroline heard the sound before she saw the shape, a thud, then a dragging, then the faintest sob. She stepped out into the curtainless gap and saw him face down near the edge of the trail, a sack across his back, blood in the snow behind him. She didn't ask questions. She took his arm, dragged him in, laid him by the fire. The others helped. Micah ran for bandages. Annabelle stirred broth. Grace, the baby born in spring, was passed to older hands, while Caroline examined the man's foot. Frostbite, deep, the kind that didn't turn black right away, the kind that turned hard first. He didn't speak for 2 days, not until the pain dulled enough that he could lie still without gritting his teeth. His name was Everett. He was a trapper, or had been. "I built too high in the pass," he said. "Thought I was smart. Kept the snow out, but the cold stayed in. First I lost the stove, then the firewood, then my toes." Caroline didn't scold. She only asked, "What made you come here?" He turned his face toward the fire. "They said a wall was missing, but that the heat stayed in." He blinked slow. "They said you breathed it." Everett stayed. He wasn't useful for hauling, couldn't walk right, but he could tan hides, and he had strong hands. By the end of January, he'd built everyone in the cabin a new pair of boots, from a single elk hide someone had traded for herbs and smoked meat. "Not mine to keep," he said. "You gave me back what the mountain tried to take." No one argued. By February, he'd married one of the Dun Hollow sisters, the one who never spoke above a whisper, but who now laughed in the evenings with her feet tucked beneath his blanket and his hands wrapped around her shoulders. The firemouth didn't just preserve life, it changed it. One morning Caroline woke early. The sun hadn't yet touched the ridge. The fire was low. The stones along the hearth shimmered faintly in the dark, still holding breath from the night before. She stepped outside. The cold bit at her, sharp as ever, but she didn't flinch. She walked barefoot through the snow. Not far, just to the ring of stones that had once been the open fire pit. It was empty now, unlit, unneeded, because the cabin had grown smarter. Micah had dug vents, Annabelle had sealed the roof tighter, and Everett had taught them all to bury stone beneath the floor, to hold heat longer than logs ever could. The breath of the firemouth had become a circle. She knelt by the old ring and brushed the snow aside. A small patch of ash remained, black and fine, the start of it all. She took a pinch and tucked it into a cloth pouch, not to keep, to remember. Then she rose and left the fire pit alone. The spring that followed was kinder. More snow melted than stayed. The river flooded but didn't swallow. Crops took root before May, and in the valley people began to speak openly of that first winter. Not just in whispers, but in stories. They wrote songs, children's songs mostly, silly, off-rhythm things. The cabin had a missing side, but still it kept the cold outside. They carved signs on fence posts, "Let the fire breathe." Some started building with open roofs for summer heat. Others mimicked Caroline's stone ring style for keeping pigs warm in the night. No one quite got it right, but everyone remembered where it came from. That widow, that missing wall, that fire. One afternoon, Caroline walked the path to Thomas's grave. Eli walked with her, now a boy tall enough to carry a shovel, stubborn enough to argue, kind enough to carry her hand. They didn't speak much on the walk, just breathed. The air was crisp, the thaw not yet finished. Patches of snow clung to the pine roots like old memories. When they reached the stones, she knelt. The grave hadn't shifted. She'd packed it with enough rock that not even a bear could disturb it. She cleared the snow, traced her fingers along the top stone, and said only one thing. "We did it." Eli watched her, said nothing. But when she stood, he wrapped his arms around her waist and held on. The last piece of the story came years later. A girl arrived from Holden's Cross, dusty and red-eyed, wearing a shawl too big for her shoulders. She was 15, carried nothing but a pouch of salt and a story. "My mother said to come here if I ever lost everything," she whispered. Caroline let her in. No questions, no judgment, just a seat by the fire. And that night, as the girl pressed her palms to the warm stones and wept without words, Caroline knew the truth. The firemouth was never about heat. It was about what people did when cold tried to unmake them. It was about refusing to seal yourself off from risk, from breath, from each other. It was about keeping space open even when the world told you to close it, even when they mocked you for it. Because in the end, that open wall, that choice not to finish what they all thought necessary, had saved more lives than 100 perfect cabins, and it had built something better than shelter. It had built belonging. When Caroline passed many years later, they didn't bury her near the creek. They buried her inside the cabin, right beneath the gap where the wall had never been. No stone, no marker, just a space where wind still whispered, and where, even now, the fire still breathes.